Hey, I'm Will Parker Anderson, the host of the Writer Circle podcast, which you're about to watch. It's a huge help to us if you would just like this video and subscribe to our channel because we want you to be a part of our writing community. Enjoy the show. Megan, thanks for joining us on the show today. I'm excited for this conversation because you bring a rare combination of gifts to the table. You're an editor who knows how to shape other writers, but you're also an accomplished author who's written adult books and children's books. So needless to say, there's so much that we can learn from you. Thanks for being with us. Great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Will.
Okay, so I thought it'd be fun. Sometimes we do this to start with 1 minute of rapid fire questions. Are you up for that?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so this is going to come at you fairly quickly. Just answer off the top of your head. Here we go. Coffee or tea?
Both.
Yeah, and you can choose both. Hardcover or paperback?
I actually like a paperback. I don't mind bending my books back a little bit.
Wow, okay. Beach or mountains?
Beach.
Nice. East Coast beach or West Coast beach? There's a question because we're from either side of the country.
Yeah, I do like a good East Coast beach, but definitely the weather and swimming is better on the West Coast. So
This is true. Shout out to California. Fiction or nonfiction?
I used to be almost always fiction, and now I've become more of a nonfiction person.
Very cool. Okay, this is a crucial one here. Mac or PC?
Oh, I am a PC person. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, we'll let that one go. If your life was a book, what would the title be?
Oh man, the Lord is so kind, maybe.
That's good. That's a hard question. I'm always amazed at how fast people are able to answer that. Okay, your go-to activity when writer's block hits?
Oh, I clean. Or dishes or, any chores around the house that need to be done. That's also my procrastination tool as well.
Nice. Favorite book you read to your kids when they were little?
Gotta be Narnia. I cry and the kids look at me like, why are you crying?
Mom, are you okay? All right,
Yeah.
This last one is perhaps the deepest question, and I got this from your Instagram. I see you've been on a quest for the perfect chocolate chip cookie. So what is the perfect chocolate chip cookie?
So the New York Times chocolate chip cookies I think are perfect, but you have to make
Whoa.
the dough 3 days in advance, so it's kind of a commitment.
Wow, 3 days in advance. Okay, is that just to let it rise, or what's the...
Yeah, it goes in the refrigerator, and it does have something to do with the gluten development. I mean, they don't rise, but there's some kind of something that has to happen, and so they have to be 3 days in advance.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm revealing my lack of baking knowledge. Do cookies rise? I don't know. I just eat them. But okay, 3 days.
They do rise, but not in the same way that bread rises over a long period of time. They rise when they hit the heat of the oven.
Gotcha. Fascinating. Okay, well, I'll have to check that out. Chocolate chip cookies are definitely my favorite kind of cookie. So good to know. All right. Well, thanks for doing the rapid fire round. I'd love to first talk to you, Megan, as an editor, because you're a managing editor at TGC and you field a lot of article submissions. Our jobs are kind of similar, I would think, in that regard, as I'm looking at book proposals, all the time. So I'd love to hear from you. What separates articles that get published from those that don't? And what are the attributes of a winning piece? Because we have writers listening who would love to be published, at their favorite organization or website. Maybe they've even been turned down before, or maybe they're too afraid to submit and they're looking for some guidance. So what would you say?
Yeah, so sort of the first thing I would say is, sometimes I get articles that are great articles, but they're not just great for us. And so knowing where it is, whether that's a book publisher or whether that's an online platform or a print magazine, knowing what kinds of things they publish is really important. So, it could be really fabulous, food writing, and I'm just not going to publish it, even though it's, the greatest restaurant review I've read, So kind of knowing the platform and what their audience is, I think is kind of the first thing. Then two other things that I would say is I'm always looking for either a really unique or compelling angle that the piece is making an argument or exploring something that I have never thought of or explored before or heard presented in that way, or something that's really compelling writing. So, it could be, we're recording this around Mother's Day, it could be an ode to your mother. Well, I've read hundreds of odes to your mother, to a mother at least. But if it's really compelling writing, then I'm willing to read and publish another one. And if you could have a unique angle and great writing, that would be a slam dunk.
Yeah, I guess I will not submit the ode to my mama that I was planning to send to you after hearing that. Let me just press a little on what you said, because it's really good. Finding a unique angle, saying something in a fresh way, easier said than done, right? So how can writers land on a unique angle? I personally see this all the time where it's like, this concept is great. It just reads a little bland, or like I've seen it before. And then the trick is helping to coach them through how to bring an element of surprise or a contrarian take, or just something that's going to help it, shine a little bit more on the page. So I don't know, any tricks of the trade that you've seen where that can move an article from predictable to interesting?
I think one of the simplest ways to do it is to shift your audience. So maybe this is something that's been said before, but you're saying it to a new group of people. And so whether that's, let's see if we could say this to kids or to teenagers, or, hey, what does this have to say to, this generation? Maybe it's never been said before in this generation. Or maybe it's, hey, how does this change the way dads live their lives? Or, so that gives you sort of both specificity. Now you're not just trying to write something for everybody in the world, which we all know is a bad idea. But also it helps you to bring that freshness because you're trying to apply something to a new group of people.
Yeah, that's a great, really helpful tip. Thinking through your readership, and I've never thought about shifting your readership. I'm always, trying to get authors to, identify who they're writing to. As you said, if you're writing to everyone, you're writing to no one. But yeah, that's an intriguing thought to kind of shift the audience altogether. It's helpful. So another thing I wanted to ask you, every editor, doesn't matter where they work, sees their fair share of bad writing. And this isn't to shame anyone. We've all submitted our fair share of mediocre content. So I certainly have, and it's how we grow. So what are some of the most common writing blunders that you see on a regular basis that maybe by naming them, writers could avoid?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just sort of a basic proofread, right? If I get something that has lots of spelling errors, that has lots of punctuation errors in it, it makes me think the writer didn't care that much about this, or they didn't spend that much time on it. So immediately it puts me off on the wrong foot. And you don't have to be a genius at copy editing. Sometimes it's giving it to your friend who's an English teacher and asking her to look at it. Like, I'm a terrible speller. I will tell you I'm a terrible speller, but I need somebody to help me, and that's fine. So, just sort of basic, like, does this look like they paid attention to spelling and punctuation and formatting? That's a huge mistake that people make. And I feel bad when I read pieces like that because I'm already disinclined to like it, and I know I shouldn't, but you almost can't help it. So, I think another thing is, having somebody else to read the piece. Somebody with fresh eyes can catch something, because sometimes I'm reading a piece and I'm thinking, there's something missing here. There's a logical leap that's been made, or there's, some element of this illustration that would have really helped this. And if this person had just had some other person read it, they would have gotten that feedback, and it would have really helped it to have all the missing pieces would be there, and I wouldn't then have to go looking for them.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, in the age of Grammarly and programs like that, there's really no excuse for bad spelling. Anything else that you consistently see? I mean, you kind of named one already of an idea that's maybe just hasn't been workshopped enough to find its unique angle. Anything else that comes to mind that you'd say, hey, watch out for this?
If I say to somebody, hey, I'm looking for 800 to 1,000 words and I get 1,500 words, then that's not great either. What you want is your editor to go back to you and say, hey, I really love this. I think we could hear 200 more words from you. Do you have them? And then you can pull them out of your bag because you've got them. But you don't want the editor to go, whoa, this is 500 more words than I asked for. Or in a book situation, this is 10,000 more words than I asked for. Because that's a really hard place to be in as an editor, to have something that just doesn't meet the criteria that you asked for.
Yeah, that's a great point, because it gets at one of, I think, the paradoxes of writing shorter form content, especially, which is that it takes so much more work and intentionality to be brief and concise than it does to be verbose and go on and on. And I don't know, it's deceptive to me. I feel like it seems like, a longer piece has more information, and it comes across as being more profound, but actually the art of elimination and really just giving readers what they need is an art in and of itself. So that's really good. Even it may not occur to a lot of writers to ask what the required word count is. They might just write and start going and then send it in. But those are some great pointers. So thank you for those. I've heard it recommended to aspiring writers who want to write books specifically, to essentially practice through short form content. So that could be articles or blogs or things like that. Do you agree with that advice? Do you feel like that's sort of a prerequisite before someone attempts to write a full book?
Yeah, I don't know that it's necessary. And of course it would depend, if what you want to write is a novel. I don't know, short form might just be so different than that. But yeah. I do think some of the benefits of short form are, like you said, it forces you to be concise, to say something in a limited word count. It also forces you to organize yourself and to get to your point, to have a point and to make it. And I think that that's true then when you go over into a book. Every chapter needs to have a point, and you need to make that point. Or, sometimes even subsections of chapters need to have something that you're trying to achieve in that short amount of space. And so, I mean, personally in my own writing, I think of books like a series of articles. I mean, there's a little more to it than that. You want it to have an overarching flow. You don't want to be choppy, but I do approach, today's writing task as if it were, this section of a chapter as if it were an article. And what's the point that I'm trying to make, and how can I make it in this number of words?
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's talk structure for a moment, because you briefly touched on that. There's nothing more daunting, I think, than an idea that's burning inside you, and you want to articulate it in a compelling way, and then you're staring at the blank page, and all that white space and the blinking cursor can kind of be paralyzing. And so without prescribing a one-size-fits-all, mold for an article, could you run us through maybe one or two structures or outlines that might help listeners organize their writing as they're coming to something like an article? Obviously, a book is a lot more involved, but so just a short-form piece of content. What are some helpful ways to think about structuring our writing?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I don't think you can go wrong with the 5-paragraph essay that you learned in 7th grade. I mean,
yes, bring it back.
If you write your first draft as if it were a 5-paragraph essay, and you have an introduction and you have 3 points that you want to make, or 3 arguments that you have, or 3 supports, and then you have a conclusion, like that's a pretty decent way to get a first draft down. And then you might find, okay, now I've got my first draft. Now here are some ways I can finesse this, or this part might need to be longer, or maybe I don't have 3 points, maybe I actually have 4 or 2. But
Yeah.
but it will never be a horrible mess if you start with a 5-paragraph essay.
Yeah, I love it. Bringing back old school high school English. It did
Yes.
matter, people. It did matter.
It did.
So in terms of introductions, I feel like, not only is that typically the first thing that you're writing as you are working on a piece, but it's also the one that makes or breaks whether a reader sticks with you. And so let's zoom in on intros for a second. What makes a good introduction?
It comes down, honestly, sometimes to the first sentence. Is there some surprising statement that you're making, some inviting sentence that leads into a story? Is there something there, particularly, in our online age where people have not invested anything in reading what you've written? It's not like they've bought a magazine subscription. It's not like they've purchased a book, so they have no reason to keep going unless it compels them in some way. And so honestly, sometimes it comes down to the first sentence. And so, if the more specific, the more catchy, the more concise, the more shocking, as it were, not clickbait, but a sentence that makes you think about something is what's going to help people to want to continue with your introduction. And then you go on and tell your story, or explain what you mean by that sentence, or kind of lead them in a little bit more. And then they've got some momentum, and hopefully they'll continue on to let you make your argument or say what you want to say.
Yeah, it's really, really helpful. I often ask the question, so what? And I try to put myself in the seat of the reader, because as writers, we're all kind of biased and, prone to our own ideas, right? And we think it's interesting. We wouldn't be writing about it if we didn't. But just, trying to hold ourselves to that rigorous test of so what? Why does someone presumably scrolling along in the internet, bouncing along, why in the world would they stop and read this? So let's talk about that for a second, of like putting our ideas before other people. I mean, you sit in a seat in your role where you have the distinct privilege of rejecting articles, but probably what's more fun is, shaping them and giving feedback to writers from all different backgrounds and stages of their craft. So it's obviously vulnerable to be edited, and it takes some finesse and also honesty. So I guess thinking of writers who might be newer to this process, or they just hate it, hate the process of having their work picked apart, what advice would you give to writers for how they can receive feedback well? How should they approach it and think about it?
Yeah, so I think 2 things. The first thing that I think is that it's important to remember that an editor is your friend. Like, the editor they want to publish your piece, and they want it to be the best that it possibly could be. Every piece that I open, every submission that I open, I think there's like this conception that I'm sitting there smoking my cigarettes and like looking for stuff to kill. And right. Really, that's not true. Like, I am so hopeful every time I open a piece that it will be good and that I can publish it, because I want to find good stuff and I want to publish it. And then when I've seen, oh, this is good, I think we could work with this, I want to make it better. I want it to make it the best version of the piece that it possibly can be. And so I think while it's hard to be edited, if you can remember, this editor wants my work to be great. That is really helpful, that they're doing what they can do to make your work better. The other thing I think, and I think this applies to writers at all levels, whether you're just starting out, it applies to me, I've been writing for a number of years, but it's a free writing class right there being edited. I mean, this
Yeah.
is writing coaching right here. If you take the time to look through and go, oh, what did they change? Oh, I wonder why they changed that. Oh, I see now. Yeah, that made it more concise. Or, oh, yeah, that made it more active. Or,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, that piece was missing in what I was saying and it was confusing. Okay, I see what they're doing. They're not going to write you, an editor doesn't have time to write you a long essay like, this is why I changed everything that I changed. But if
Yeah.
you take the time to go through and see what they did, that's writing coaching right there, and
Yeah.
you can get it for free, and it's great.
It is great. As you're talking, I actually just remembered. So I was writing some marketing copy for, I think, the organization that you work for. And I think it was you, honestly, who the marketing copy was aimed at women, and it was to promo a book. And I think it was you, maybe it was someone else, but who said, "Oh, this question you're asking isn't one that women ask. Like, how about this one instead?" And I remember reading that comment, like it literally just came back to me and thinking, wow, that's really helpful. And just it really is a great process. Sometimes it can sting for sure. I'm not denying that, but just, yeah, the seeing your work reach a level of clarity and sometimes profundity that it never would have on its own. Now, I imagine you too, you work in an environment of editors and writers, so you sort of have a built-in system of feedback even for your own stuff. How has that shaped you, as you have written through the years? And I think you have at least 7 books. So, yeah, how is existing in that environment and colleagues also being your editors, how has that shaped you as a writer?
Yeah, I have just been really thankful. I mean, I feel like that's how I've learned to write is by being edited and
Yeah.
seeing what other people do with my work. But I would also say, that there is room for pushing back. Just
Hmm.
because an editor suggests a change doesn't mean you have to accept it.
Yeah. Good
And
point.
you know, my husband always says to me, your name is going to be on that book or your name is going to be on that article. And so if it's not something that I want to accept and put my name on it, I don't have to accept it. Now, that might mean that it's going to be a deal breaker, but
Hmm.
most of the time it's not a deal breaker. And I
Yeah.
do think it is important to remember, this is your work and your name is on it. And so there are going to be times when you can say, actually didn't like that change. Is it possible to not make that change?
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a great point. Editors are not perfect, not even close. And
No.
so it is a give and take. And yeah, I think that humility, but also that backbone that you're talking about is important, as you're coming to receive feedback. Well, let's take off your editorial hat now and talk about the writing life, because you're also, we've been talking about writing, but you've published, I believe it's 7 books, and you've also co-authored some stuff. And so I wanted to look at your most recent title, which is called Sighing on Sunday, 40 Meditations for When Church Hurts. And on your Instagram, to promote this book, you said, hoping this book is a balm to readers, like a healing balm. And I love that image. So I wanted to ask you, can you just talk to us about how words have the power to heal and the role authors can play in that process? I find that image like so intriguing and a really noble, I think, reason to pursue writing something. So yeah, how can words help people to heal?
I think the first way that words help people to heal is by helping people to feel seen.
Hmm.
And, there's just power and comfort even in naming a problem, in naming that that problem exists in the world. And so
Yeah.
for somebody to pick up a book or pick up an article and go, hey, this is talking about me. And somebody sees that this is a hurtful thing, or this is a painful thing. I think that's hugely helpful. I think, sometimes the writer has experiences of her own, that she can then bring into the writing, even if it's not, sort of memoir style, but even as a short illustration, or an anecdote here and there. I think that gives healing, because then that sets the writer up as the reader's friend, as somebody coming alongside the reader, and somebody who's in some way been there, not necessarily making it all about the writer's experience, but just sort of a tone of understanding and compassion. And then I think there is just healing in sort of universal truths, and in truths from the Bible and from the scripture, that are encouragement and balm that we can point people to. So that we can show them. And if we write in a way that is sympathetic, that is lovely, that's tender, then I think we can share those things in a way that's helpful.
Yeah, that's insightful. I also just think, as you're writing to help those with church hurt specifically, you grew up a pastor's kid, according to your bio, and I imagine because of that, you had a front row seat to some of the challenges that come with, your dad leading a church. You're now married to a pastor as well. And so you've seen and heard a lot of that. And as someone who's seen behind the curtain of ministry, as it were, and who's now writing about church hurt, one thing I appreciate is how you balance honesty about the hurt that does exist with hope about the beauty that the church still is. And that sort of, push and pull is difficult to maintain, but it's important, because if you go too far one way or the other, right? On one hand, you're jaded, and on the other hand, you're idealistic and detached from reality. And so how do you personally, whether it's church hurt or another topic, how do you balance the gritty with the hopeful?
Yeah, I mean, that book was far and away the hardest thing I've ever written, for that very reason. Trying to be tender and also truthful, and just that balance. It was just extremely difficult to do, and I can only hope that I did it well. But I think that the more that you have a particular person or a group of people in mind as your audience, as you're writing, I think that is super helpful. That's helpful for all kinds of writing, not even on tricky topics, but to think, I am writing this book for, my friend John and others like John. And what would I say to John? And, chances are, if you're thinking of John, this person that you dearly love, that you're not going to write something that's scoldy, because you would never be scoldy to John because you love him. And you also probably wouldn't let John off the hook. You probably would say a few challenging things to John because you love him as well. And so, the more that you can keep in your mind, I'm writing to a real person, and maybe even call up a real person or two in your mind that you have in mind, it really does help with tone on all kinds of issues.
Wow, it is so humbling, isn't it, when you actually bring your ideas to a real person? And my wife is often that person for me, and we're very different, and I love that about her, and I love she cares about things or sees things in ways that I just don't. And she'll be like, yeah, that doesn't make sense, or I think you phrased this in a way that's not quite right. And it's super humbling. I guess we're circling back to feedback again, but it's really good to, as you said, picture your ideal reader, but then to actually go in and talk with real people. And you're not just living in your own little literary world that you've curated. Just a practical question here. Beyond your work at TGC, you've published with Washington Post, Christianity Today, Table Talk, a bunch of other places. Can you give some practical pointers to writers who are hoping to publish articles or shorter content? Where do they even start? That's a question that I often hear.
Yeah, that is a great question. So, some of it is for at least for me and my own story was sort of making friends with other writers. First of
Mm,
all, it started just as a how do I learn about the writing life and then giving
yeah.
feedback to one another as we've already talked about. But then also then other writers will be people who have published somewhere, and I started writing for, this was back in the day of blogs, and I started writing for, various contributor blogs, and I would write something on my friend's blog and she would write on mine, and
Yeah.
maybe now that's, doing something on an Instagram live with somebody, or, just sort of collaborating with people. And then they also will know, hey, I know this editor over here. She's looking for something. There's a certain networking situation that happens where they can introduce you to people, you can introduce them to people. And I know, I mean, networking sounds, it can have sort of a icky kind of feeling to it. But it's not, I don't mean it in that way at all. I just mean that is how you learn what editors want what and how to get
Yeah.
in contact with them. And if you've got a good thing to write, that editor wants to hear from you. So it's not an icky thing at all. They're actually glad that you met somebody else who pointed you to them.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true. Relationship is catalytic, for everything that I've written as well. Tell us some of your story. How did you get into writing? Was it something that you loved from an early age? And what were some of those, I guess, major milestones for you in your own writing career?
I so I always wanted to be a writer ever since I was a kid, but
Nice.
then when I went to college, I trained to be an English teacher because I didn't feel like my parents didn't feel like I could pay the bills if I was a writer, which is absolutely true. I still don't pay my bills by being a writer, so
Yeah.
they were spot on. So I became an English high school English teacher and taught English for a number of years, and always kind of writing was in the back of my mind, but it wasn't something that I was actively working on. Teaching and writing are pretty similar skill sets, and so I just
Hmm.
didn't have, at the end of the day, I didn't have extra sentences to write. And
Yeah.
so, but then I was married, and then I began to have children, so I took some time off from teaching, and I had a little bit more bandwidth in my life, and so I started writing some things, and I wrote. I had a blog for a little while. Then I wrote for some friends for their different things. They introduced me to some editors, and so I wrote for very small, like sort of church and denomination based websites and blogs. And then eventually somebody introduced me. I wrote a piece, and the guy who was in charge of that website said, "This isn't right for me, but I know somebody at Christianity Today. I bet it would work for them." And so he introduced me to somebody at Christianity Today. So then I started writing for them, and then through that, then I got to meet some people at the Gospel Coalition and started writing over there. My books came about because there was Gloria Furman was working at the time for Crossway Publishers
Hmm.
and for the Gospel Coalition, and she was tasked with finding women who wanted to write books. And so
Yeah.
she called me up and said, "Do you want to write a book?" And which is right everybody's dream, except I didn't want to write a book. So I said, "No, I don't have any ideas. I don't want to write a book." And then she said, "Well, if you ever do, call me back." And so
Yeah.
but that put the thought into my head, like, oh.
Right.
And so then I circled back and said, "No, wait, actually, I do have an idea." And I wanted to write a book about corporate prayer, about praying with
Mm.
other people, which ended up being my first book. And she was super encouraging about that, and so I got to write that book.
That's incredible. Yeah. I mean, even in the story you just shared, you can hear sort of those relational, organic connections that open doors. And yeah, I've experienced much of the same. So, okay, so you've also written children's books, and I wanted to definitely talk to you about this for a number of reasons. Personally, I have three kids who are all under 5, and so like so much of my time is spent reading them books, and I've been reminded in a new way in this season of how formative books are in the lives of children. And as a parent, I've been reminded of how important it is to steward the words that you are really saturating your kids in. And thankfully, there's so many good ones out there, including yours. So you've written Meg is Not Alone and Fritz in the Midnight Meetup, which is just an intriguing title. So yeah, I would love, to just pick your brain about if anything changes in the way you think and write when you're approaching a kid's book. Now, obviously, the audience who you're writing to, but what sorts of things are you thinking through, praying through as you're writing for kids? Because it really is a sacred calling to capture the imagination of children and to teach them things through story. So, yeah, just anything you want to share about the process of writing a kid's book, we'd love to hear.
Yeah, I feel like kids' books are maybe even more than my adult books are things that have just kind of marinated for a really long time.
Yeah.
And because a kid's book is such a distillation of, it might only be 1,000 words long or something,
Yeah.
especially if we're talking about picture books, right?
Right.
And so it really has to be just kind of one thing just distilled into this
Yeah.
very very concentrated little bit. And so both of the children's books that I've written have just been, like years of thinking through how could I tell this story? What could so I've always started with sort of, well, the two books are a little bit different, but Meg is Not Alone is the story of a time that my parents left me at church. And it's a true story. I got left at
Oh,
church as a
man.
kid. And but what dad thought I was with mom thought I was with dad. But that was the first moment in my life. I was probably about 4, I would say, that I realized that the people in the church cared about me. And because they came around and took care of me and called my parents, and that, I realized I wasn't just sort of an appendage to my parents, but I was important in this church and people loved me. And that was so formative in my own life. And so I just was always thinking, like, how, could I give other kids kind of this glimpse of the fact that they're important as well. And in the end, I didn't know at first, but then in the end, I just ended up telling my own story and telling it as if it were a fictional story,
Yeah.
about a little girl named Meg who gets lost at the church. And so my hope is that, that was my experience, but that kids could kind of live through that experience themselves and have that reminder that they're important in the church.
Yeah. I love that message. So have to ask you now, is the trauma from the Meg is Not Alone story, is that what created the need for sighing on Sunday for for the healing? I see a connection.
Yes,
Something to ponder in your own
everything's
quiet
all
time.
connected.
Yeah, exactly. That's incredible. I wanted to ask you this too, because you work for, a largely digital platform. We live in the frenzied age of digital content, streaming and scrolling. So I'm often puzzled by this and delighted at the same time that books still sell and that books still matter. And why do you think people still come to the written word when there's so many flashy digital mediums available? Why does page and print still capture us?
Yeah, there's something sort of immersive about a book, isn't there? I mean, that it's not offering you anything other than this story or this exploration of this topic. And so there's a way in which we can become sort of immersed in something that's in print, just partly because of its very sort of static nature, and it's
Wow.
not
Yeah.
having notifications ping up and whatever. And I see this. The two places that I see people reading when I'm out and about are on airplanes, subways, buses. When they're traveling, people read books. I see that. And then I also see it like at the beach on vacation, or, if you're at a hotel or something like that. Those are the places I see books most often. And I almost wonder if there's like a certain kind of, I just want to be immersed in something. I want to be transported to some other place or to some other
Yeah.
idea. And so in those times, we're kind of drawn to that immersive print.
That's a great take. My summary, I think, of what you just said is that books are almost a merciful reprieve from just the craziness that is
Yeah.
life in the digital age. And
Yeah.
so true. It's also really insightful to name where and when books are read, in places of leisure or, as you said, on flights or, yeah, that's great. And I am so glad that books are still selling, not just because I work for a publisher, but I think there's something obviously really healthy, spiritually and mentally about, yeah, getting into a good book. Well, Megan, thank you so much for being with us. I have one kind of final two-tier question, and it's one that I like to ask at the end of each show. And so maybe I'll ask them separately so you can focus on each one. So the first is just, can you leave us with perhaps one practice or habit for writers looking to grow? It could be something that you yourself have implemented or someone taught you along the way or you picked up from somewhere, but what would be a good practice or habit for writers to take with them?
So one thing that I do is I read the restaurant reviews in the New Yorker, and
Ah,
they are very short. They are probably maybe 300 words, but in 300 words, the restaurant reviewer is attempting to communicate something about the ambiance of the place, something about the tastes and the smells of the actual experience of eating the food, and then some factual information like how much it cost or where it's located. And all of that in 300 words. And I
wow.
think those restaurant reviews are just like a master class in how you can kind of give both kind of an emotional sensory experience and also some basic information in a really small but engaging piece of writing. So I read them and try to learn from them, even though I don't write restaurant reviews, but just as kind of a test case of how to be
Yeah.
compelling and concise.
Wow, no, that right there is a fresh take that I've never heard. I love that. It's honestly in unorthodox or unexpected places that I think we can mine, like looking outside of our usual discipline or niche. I think that's really great advice. Are those available to anyone, like to the public, or do you have to have a subscription?
I'm not sure. I get a print subscription, but I would assume
Yeah.
they're online and you can get them. Or you
Yeah.
could
Yeah.
read any restaurant reviews would probably do because they're all the same. That's the point of them, to compel you to go to this restaurant and tell you kind of what it feels like in a short amount of time.
Yeah. It's funny. I don't read many restaurant reviews, but we love Thai food. And so one of our local places, they had a newspaper article on the wall and it told the story of the chef and her history and kind of where she'd been and what makes her recipes unique. And I was kind of captivated by it. I was like, this is just a world I know nothing about. And it's super cool, just to
Yeah.
get some of that backstory and from someone who's an expert on that type of food. But okay, so last and second question here to this final piece would be, can you just, it's up to you, but could you give a word of encouragement or even almost a prayer over writers who really do desire to glorify Jesus and to help readers and to exercise the gift that God has given to them? There's people listening who are discouraged, timid, maybe successful across the spectrum. But what would you want to say to writers heart to heart that would encourage them in their craft?
So I always turn to our God, who is the speaking God. And, at the beginning, he spoke all things into existence. And so he is a God who communicates and who speaks. And then he created people who have the capacity for language and for speaking. And then he communicated with those people in his word, which is just an amazingly varied book, and it's precise and it's careful, and yet it's also compelling and interesting. And I think that we can be encouraged in our writing labors, that the writing that we do and the way that we push ourselves to excellence and to careful and to clear and compelling writing is really modeling after our speaking God, who spoke and who enabled us to speak. And so that we're doing good work and God honoring work when we seek to write even like God speaks.
Wow. That's theologically rich. And yeah, it really is amazing when you look at the story of Scripture, the primacy of words and, as those made in his image, everything you just said, we too are speaking beings. So that's something to tuck away, writers, as you sit down for the next time to get at it. So, well, Megan, thank you for being on the show. We are grateful for the ways that you shape other writers for the kingdom, and also for your words and how they've shaped us. Really enjoyed this conversation, and we look forward to reading your newest book, Sighing on Sunday. But yeah, thanks again for sharing some of your wisdom with us.
Thanks for having me, Will.